မင်္ဂလာပါရှင်ဒီမိုကရေစီအစိုးရလက်ထက်မှာမဲဆန္ဒရှင်ပေါင်း28တန်းကျော်မဲပေးခဲ့တဲ့2020ရွေးကောက်ပွဲရလဒ်ကိုတရားဝင်မှုဆိုပြီးပယ်ဖျက်ကအာဏာသိမ်းခဲ့တဲ့အကြမ်းဖက်စစ်ကောင်စီဟာမကြာခင်မှာရွေးကောက်ပွဲကျင်းပမယ်လို့ကြေညာထားပါတယ်အကြမ်းဖက်စစ်ကောင်စီကကျင်းပမယ်ဒီရွေးကောက်ပွဲဟာအရင်ရွေးကောက်ပွဲတွေနဲ့မတူဘဲအချိုးကျကိုစားပြုစနစ်နဲ့ကျင်းပမယ်လို့ဆိုထားတာကြောင့်သူတို့အာဏာတည်မြဲရေးအတွက်လုပ်မဲ့ဒီအကြမ်းဖက်စစ်ကောင်စီရဲ့ရွေးကောက်ပွဲဟာတရားဝင်သလားတိုင်းရင်းသားအားလုံးကိုကိုစားပြုတဲ့စနစ်ဖြစ်နိုင်မှာမလား2020ရွေးကောက်ပွဲရလဒ်ကိုစစ်တပ်ကလက်မခံဘဲငင်းပယ်ခဲ့တာကိုနိုင်ငံတကာဘက်ကကောဘယ်လိုနားလည်လက်ခံထားပါသလဲမြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာဒီမိုကရေစီပြန်လည်ရှင်သန်ရေးအကူအညီပေးရေးလှုပ်ဆောင်နေတာတွေနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးမြန်မာနိုင်ငံလွှတ်တော်ဖွံ့ဖြိုးရေးအထောက်အကူပြုလုပ်ငန်းတွေကိုစစ်စစ်မပြတ်ကူညီပံ့ပိုးပေးနေတဲ့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံဒီမိုကရေစီနဲ့ရွေးကောက်ပွဲဆိုင်ရာအကူအညီပေးရေးနိုင်ငံတကာအဖွဲ့အစည်းကြီးတစ်ခုဖြစ်တဲ့ International IDE ရဲ့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံဆိုင်ရာအကြီးအကဲဒေါက်တာမားကတ်စ်ဘရန်နဲ့ဆက်သွယ်မေးမြန်းကြည့်ပါမယ်ရှင်မင်္ဂလာပါရှင်2020ရွေးကောက်ပွဲမှာဒီမဲဆန္ဒရှင်ပေါင်း28တန်းကျော်မဲပေးခဲ့ပါတယ်ရှင်ဒါပေမဲ့စစ်တပ်ကအာဏာသိမ်းပြီးတဲ့နောက်မှာတော့ဒီ2020ရွေးကောက်ပွဲရလဒ်ကိုပယ်ဖျက်လိုက်တာဟာတရားဝင်တယ်လို့ထင်ပါသလားရှင်
So your question is whether it was legal for the military to take over power and to cancel the elections, and the clear answer has to be no. And it has also been made very clear by a whole range of analysis and statements right after the military coup that what the military was doing was not covered by the 2008 Constitution. The military has been claiming already after the elections in November 2020 that there was something wrong with these elections. But first of all, it was not the military's mandate to investigate or to look into irregularities at the elections, but there was a process of collecting and processing complaints. And the Union Election Commission was doing exactly that. And the Union Election Commission had finalized and certified the elections. And had published the result. And therefore, first of all, the military had no constitutional or legal role to interfere in this process. And then certainly the declaration of the state of emergency and the detention of the president and of the state councillor was not covered by any legal basis whatsoever. And that is also why the coup has been illegal from the beginning. And any of the actions the military and military-controlled institutions have taken after that, like cancelling the elections, have no legal basis.
ဟုတ်ကဲ့ပါရှင်။ဟုတ်ဆက်ပြီးတော့မေးချင်တဲ့မေးခွန်းပါနော်။ဒီ2020ရွေးကောက်ပွဲရလဒ်ကိုအတိမတ်မပြုဘဲစစ်တပ်ကဒီရွေးကောက်ပွဲအခုလိုမျိုးပေါ့နော်ထပ်ပြီးတော့ကျင်းပမယ်ဆိုရင်ဒီရွေးကောက်ပွဲဟာရောတရားဝင်မှုအခြေအနေကဘယ်လိုရှိနိုင်ပါသလဲရှင်။ဥပမာပေါ့နော်စစ်တပ်ကကျင်းပတဲ့ရွေးကောက်ပွဲရတက်လာတဲ့အစိုးရရဲ့တရားဝင်မှုကိုကျွန်မမေးမြန်းခြင်းဖြစ်ပါတယ်ရှင်။
No, it is not, because the military has first of all, it did not have a role under the 2008 Constitution to interfere in the electoral process or to cancel elections. The most important thing to understand is that the coup itself was unconstitutional and illegal, and therefore the regime that the military has tried to create through the SAC is illegal and illegitimate and is not actually in line with the words of the 2008 Constitution. So that is the important thing, and that the election of November 2020 was already finished or finalized in the sense that the parliament had already been certified and the MPs were about to go to the Luto and take up their office. And the only institution under the 2008 Constitution that had the power to declare elections invalid is the Election Commission itself. And that's why when it was acting independently, and when the military failed to put enough pressure on the Election Commission to stop the convening of the parliament, the military decided to basically use physical violence to prevent the convening of the parliament. And then subsequently, when the military installed illegal Union Election Commission, declared the elections invalid, that was in itself an illegal act, and it also had no grounds on the basis that they were claiming, namely that there was massive electoral fraud in the November 2020 elections. That has never been proven. In fact, it has been very clearly explained how this is a completely fictitious narrative, and that is not credible. And that's why, neither the procedure nor in merits is this in any way a legitimate or legal decision. So in other words, the election result of 2020 has its validity, but there is, of course, now the question that the entire 2008 constitution, because of the acts of the military, has lost its political legitimacy. And that's why we find ourselves in a new phase, in a constitutional vacuum, in which a new constitution is being worked out by the representatives of the people, which includes the elected members of the parliament, but also other representatives of the people.
Okay, ရှင်ဟိုကျွန်မခုနမေးလိုက်တာကကြတော့ဒီ2020ရွေးကောက်ပွဲကအခုလိုမျိုးပြောသလိုပဲပေါ့နော်တရားဝင်တယ်ဒါပေမဲ့သူတို့ဘက်ကဒါကိုအတိမတ်မပြုဘူးပြီးတော့အခုလက်ရှိမှာဆိုရင်စစ်တပ်ဘက်ကရွေးကောက်ပွဲထပ်ကျင်းပဖို့လုပ်နေပါတယ်ရှင်အခုထပ်လုပ်မဲ့ရွေးကောက်ပွဲကရောဒီတရားဝင်မှုဟိုတရားဝင်တယ်လို့ပြောလို့ရလားဘယ်လိုအခြေအနေမှာရှိတယ်လဲရှင်
So I think it is quite clear that what the military is trying to do is to legitimize its own rule, to retroactively legitimize its coup, and to create a parliament that basically carries out the will of the military. But a parliament in a democracy is supposed to represent the will of the people, not the will of the military. And so what the military is now trying to do is to create the appearance of an election, which is not at all an election, and we therefore do not call it an election, because there is absolutely no political basis at this moment to have a genuine election. In international law, there is a requirement that elections are a genuine reflection of the will of the people, and if you basically exclude the most popular political parties and the leading political figures, and if you ban the freedom of expression and the freedom of assembly, and you sort of manipulate the system to sort of predict the result, that's not a democratic election. So I would say the international community as a whole is quite clear that this upcoming electoral exercise does not have democratic legitimacy and will not create a legitimate democratic parliament that represents the will of the people. Instead, you actually have still an elected parliament in place that is struggling to continue its work, reaching out to the people and representing their interests, working together in a wide coalition of different groups and other representatives to build a new country. And I think the people of Myanmar have made it quite clear that they do not want to live any longer in a system that is ultimately controlled by the military, but they want to have self-determination, as is their right. As all nations in the world have the right to decide over their own destiny in a democratic process. And the military is simply trying to hold on to its privileged status and position above the law that the people no longer accept that this is our understanding, and this is very clearly what the people have been saying. And I would like to also remind you that just a few weeks ago, the UN Security Council took a decision, a resolution, to demand from the Myanmar military to release President Win Myint and the state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi. And until and unless the military releases all the illegally detained political prisoners and gives them freedom to campaign and to participate in the political process, there is absolutely no basis for having a genuine democratic election.
ဟုတ်ကဲ့ပါရှင့်ဒီပေါ့နော်ကျမတို့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာပြီးခဲ့တဲ့ဒီရင်တုန်းကကျင်းပခဲ့တဲ့ရွေးကောက်ပွဲတွေကအလုံးအများသူနိုင်ပေါ့နော်များသူနိုင်သူအကုန်ယူပေါ့နော် FPTC TP ပေါ့နော် FPTV စနစ်ကိုကျမတို့ကကျင့်သုံးခဲ့တယ်အခုဒီလာမဲ့ဒီစစ်ကောင်စီလုံးမဲ့ရွေးကောက်ပွဲမှာကြတော့အချိုးကျစနစ်ကိုပြောင်းလဲလိုက်တယ်ရှင့်ဆိုတော့ဒီရဲ့နောက်ွယ်မှာပေါ့ဒီသူတို့ပြောထားသလိုပေါ့နော်အမှန်တကယ်ဒီအချိုးကျစနစ်ကနေတိုင်းရင်းသားအားလုံးကိုကိုပြဒီအချိုးကျစနစ်ဟာဒီတိုင်းရင်းသားအားလုံးကိုကိုစားပြုတဲ့စနစ်ဖြစ်လာနိုင်ပါမလားရှင့်
Well, the choice of electoral system is a complicated question, and even in Myanmar, the introduction of a proportional system has been discussed for many years. Traditionally, elections in Myanmar have been taking place under the first past the post system, which essentially allows voters to vote directly for individual representatives for a constituency in which, like in the first past the post, the person who has the highest number of votes represents that constituency. And this has been, in principle, a popular model among the voters in Myanmar. But it has the disadvantage that it over-represents, to some extent, the winning party. So, for example, in the 2020 elections, the NLD got about 60% of the votes, but won about 80% of the seats because of this type of system. And so there is a certain distortion. But several countries around the world use the first past the post system. There are some advantages in a proportional system in the sense that, for example, it allows easier to introduce a women's quota. So, for example, if you have a quota of 30% women, it's easier to use that in a proportional system. Or if you want to, introduce certain affirmative action for underrepresented groups. But what the military is now trying to do is essentially a deception of trying to lure some of the ethnic minorities into this exercise by promising them that a proportional system would give them higher chances of being represented. And some of these parties believe that this will be an opportunity for them to have to be represented with more members in the Union Parliament. But if you actually play it through with the numbers, as we have done, then you realize that this is not actually the case. Actually, even in the past elections, because of the constituency sizes, some of the smaller ethnic parties only had a chance to win a seat because of the first past the post system. So basically, the answer is it's complicated, and the answer lies in the details. There are certain advantages to different types of electoral system, but what is most important is that this is a transparent process that involves all the electoral stakeholders and explains to the general public what exactly is being proposed. And that we have not seen from the military, obviously. So this introduction of a PR system is just part of the deception and part of the effort by the military to boost the chances of its own proxy parties and to diminish any possible power of a party that would stand against its political role, like the NLD. So I would not, plus, I mean, there is one very big, let's say, problem in this whole strategy of the military, which is, of course, that it still wants to organize elections under the 2008 constitution, which gives a quarter of the seats to the military without having been elected, and obviously without being proportional to its size. So this is, you know, if the military really wanted to make elections proportional, the first thing they need to do is to take out the military seats from the parliament, because that is the most disproportional overrepresentation that cannot really be justified in any way by any democratic standards.
အခုလိုမျိုးဒီချိုးချစနစ်ကိုစားပြုစနစ်ကပေါ့နော်ခုနပြောသလိုမျိုးဒီလိုမျိုးအခြေအနေတွေရှိရဲ့ကြားထဲမှာဒီစစ်တပ်ပြောင်းလဲလိုက်တဲ့ကိုထပ်မေးချင်တဲ့ဘေးကုန်းကတော့ပေါ့နော်ဒီချိုးချစနစ်ဟာလက်ရှိမြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာပြဋ္ဌာန်းထားတဲ့လုပ်ထားတဲ့ရွေးကောက်ပွဲစနစ်တွေအခြေခံဥပဒေနဲ့ကိုကိုက်ညီလားရှင်မကိုက်ညီရင်စစ်တပ်ကဘာကြောင့် PR စနစ်ကိုအသုံးပြုဖို့အတွက်အခုကြေညာလိုက်တာပါလဲရှင်
So again, the military has maneuvered itself into a deep black hole when it comes to legal basis. First of all, the coup itself and the state of emergency were illegal. The more often they extend the state of emergency, the more illegal it becomes. And any action that they take to issue new laws or to appoint new institutions, all of that does not have a legal basis. Plus, even if you assume that the 2008 constitution is still in place, which I said is not, but even if you take that assumption, the understanding among constitutional lawyers was that without a constitutional amendment, it would not be possible to introduce a full-fledged proportional system, because that was already discussed about 10 years ago and then set aside before the 2015 elections. And it was the military essentially that constantly refused to go along with amending the 2008 constitution. So, you know, to organize a new election, a genuine good democratic election, a number of changes would be recommended that have been made for many years by international election observers and experts. That could require a change of electoral system, but not necessarily. But even within the first past the post system, there is a very big discrepancy, or let's say the technical term for this is called malapportionment, which means that the sizes of constituencies are very different, and that because the township sizes are very different, and that means that some townships, very small townships, are represented by one person in parliament, and a very big, maybe 100 times bigger township also just has one seat in parliament, and that is disproportionate. So even in first past the post systems around the world, there is an effort usually to keep the constituency sizes more or less equal size, so that each voter is more or less represented in the same way and by the same power. So there are different ways of fixing some of the weaknesses of the electoral system in the past. But again, at this moment, the military lacks the legal or political mandate and authority to hold a new election that is genuine and that genuinely reflects the will of the people. For that, first of all, political freedoms need to be reestablished. Trust has to be reestablished. There needs to be a free discussion about the design of the new political dispensation. And this discussion on a new constitutional framework that would be federal and decentralized has already started. And so the discussion on a future electoral system has to be part of that constitutional debate. And now for the military to come and just ram through an election to perpetuate its own rule, that is completely illegitimate and contrary to what the people in Myanmar want.
ဟုတ်ကဲ့ပါရှင့်ဒီနိုင်ငံတကာဘက်ကပေါ့နော်ဒီ2020ရွေးကောက်ပွဲကိုလွတ်လပ်ပြီးတရားမျှတတယ်လို့ပြောဆိုနေတဲ့အချိန်မှာပဲဒီရလဒ်ကိုစစ်တပ်ကလက်မခံပဲညှင်းပယ်တယ်ညှင်းပယ်ရုံနဲ့မကပဲနဲ့ပေါ့နော်ဒီနောက်ထပ်ရွေးကောက်ပွဲအသစ်ကိုလည်းထပ်ပြီးလုပ်ဖို့စစ်ကောင်စီဘက်ကနေကြိုးပမ်းနေတာရှိပါတယ်ဒါနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့နိုင်ငံတကာဘက်ကဘယ်လိုနားလဲလက်ခံထားပါသလဲရှင့်
Well, the 2020 elections took place under special circumstances, still, in the middle of the pandemic. And therefore, it was difficult to conduct the elections, but it was also difficult to observe the elections. But nevertheless, a number of credible international observer groups did spend months in Myanmar, talked to thousands of people, looked into all of the processes and established that the elections themselves were legitimate and accurately reflected the will of the people. Generally, they do not use the term free and fair, but essentially that is what they meant. But they also pointed to weaknesses and shortcomings in the process. The 2020 elections were not perfect by all means. Even our own organization, International IDEA, reminded the Election Commission of the importance to be inclusive and to be transparent, which was not always the case. So there are quite a number of recommendations for how to further improve elections. But nonetheless, the international community recognized the result, and also internally in Myanmar, the result was very clearly accepted and recognized, except by the military and some of its proxy parties, who simply did not like the political result. They simply do not like to hear the message that the people are sending to them. Whenever the people have been asked over the last 30 years, they very clearly say that they do not want to have military rule, and they do not want to be ruled by a military proxy party, and they do not want to have a system that gives disproportionate power and influence to the military. And the military simply does not want to hear that and accept that message. And that's why they first thought that they could manipulate the 2008 constitution to their benefit. And when that did not work, because the president stood firm and refused to play along, they had to take him out and take power by force. And then the people, of course, rose up in disbelief and in protest because they cannot accept that. So it's actually a very simple, straightforward story. The sad thing is that this has been going on for 2 years now with no end in sight, because the military simply does not want to accept what the people are expressing very clearly. So the international community has, first of all, taken a very clear position after the coup, denouncing it as illegal and illegitimate. The UN General Assembly has clearly stated in June 21 that the electoral results should be respected, that the parliament should be allowed to form, and that the path to democracy should be restored. Similar things were said by the UN Security Council, by the European Parliament, by many other international parliaments, and by governments. There are some members of the international community who take a more short-term view of pragmatic engagement with the de facto powers in Naypyidaw, but I think they also increasingly realize that this election exercise that the military is planning is not the way forward, is not a step towards normalization and stability, and would rather just extend the crisis and the insecurity in the country. So I believe that when the international community remembers its own principles of what is an election, what is genuine democracy, it's very clear that the military is on the wrong track.